On April 28, 1967, at exactly 8 in the morning, in the damp, cheap tobacco and government wax-scented building of the Induction Center in Houston, Texas, a scene was unfolding that was more terrifying than any knockout in the ring, because here, in this faceless room, there was no referee to stop the beating. You are used to seeing Muhammad Ali in the spotlight, dancing and shouting, but if you had been there in that second, you would have seen a man turn to stone. Dozens of frightened boys stood around him, trembling at the thought of the jungles of Vietnam. But all eyes were fixed on one figure, and the tension in the air was so dense it seemed one spark would blow the building sky high. A U.S. Army officer, Lieutenant Stephen Dunkley, held a list in his hands that was heavier than any championship belt, for it contained a name capable of splitting the nation in half. The lieutenant took a breath and shouted, "Cassius Clay!" This name echoed off the concrete walls, but there was no movement or sound in response, only an absolute vacuum-like silence that made ears ring. You think Ali didn't hear? He heard every word, but he knew what others did not. This was not just a roll call, it was a trap set with diabolical precision. One step forward, just half a meter of space, separated him from safety, from keeping his title, from millions of dollars, and the status of a national hero who would be allowed to simply shake hands with soldiers in the rear without ever smelling gunpowder. But if he remained in place, if he did not cross that invisible line, his life as he knew it would be destroyed instantly and forever. The officer, not believing his eyes, repeated louder, with a clear threat in his voice, "Cassius Clay, step forward." And this is where that psychological break occurs that you must feel with your skin. Any normal person, having everything Ali had, would have taken that step, because the instinct of self-preservation screams, "Save yourself!" But Ali stood as if rooted to the ground. You look at his face in this moment and look for fear, look for doubt, but you find only a frightening emptiness there, and it is in this emptiness that the detail hides, that very dagger that most historians overlook. Look at his hands, lower your gaze. In such a moment, any man's fists clench involuntarily. Knuckles turn white from adrenaline. The body prepares for fight or flight, but Ali's hands, they were absolutely frighteningly relaxed. They hung along his body, palms open, fingers not trembling. Why? It seems insignificant, but this very detail flips the meaning of what was happening on its head. You thought he was waging a war against the government. No. These relaxed hands said that he had already finished his war inside himself. While the lieutenant turned purple with rage, realizing he was losing control of the situation, Ali was in a state of profound peace because he had made his choice long before he entered that room. He was not just refusing to serve, he was refusing to acknowledge the very name Cassius Clay that the officer was shouting, considering it a slave name, and with his inaction, he dealt a blow to the system harder than any right hook. The officer, for the third time, his voice breaking into a scream, pronounced the name, and at that moment time stopped completely, turning seconds into hours, while the world outside the building held its breath, waiting to see if the strongest man on the planet would break under the weight of the state machine, or if he was ready to burn to the ground for a word he had not even spoken aloud yet. Exactly 60 minutes passed from the moment Ali failed to take that fatal step, and in this unit of time, short as a magnesium flash, his life was not just destroyed, it was erased by the eraser of the state machine, with such cruelty that it resembled a public execution without a guillotine. You probably think the worst part was the handcuffs snapping on his wrists, or the camera flashes blinding him as he left the induction center, but you are mistaken, because the real torture began not in the police station, but in the offices of officials. In an instant, faster than he could throw a jab, Cassius Clay turned from a national idol into a black draft dodger, a traitor, a target for the spit of every patriot, with a flag on their lawn. The athletic commissions of all 50 states acted in sync, like a firing squad. His boxing license was taken away, his passport was stripped so he couldn't flee abroad, and earn bread by fighting in Europe or Africa. And finally, they took the championship belt he had won with blood. But here arises the question that should haunt you. Why were they in such a hurry? Bureaucracy usually works for months, but Ali was destroyed in half a day. The answer is simple and cynical. They didn't just want to punish him. They wanted to steal from him something that cannot be returned for any amount of money: his time. Imagine an athlete at his absolute divine peak of form. He is 25 years old. His legs are faster than the wind. His reflexes are sharper than a razor. He is the perfect weapon. And at this exact moment, he is locked in a vacuum. This is the beginning of the period historians will later call the ghost years. And this is the most tragic part of the puzzle. 3.5 years, 1,200 days of inactivity. You think he was resting? No. He was rotting alive, without training, without fights, without a goal. His body began to change. He gained weight. His legendary speed began to fade. The floating butterfly was turning into a heavy, grounded fighter. Every day of this downtime was a crime against sport. It is as if Michelangelo were forbidden to touch marble while his hands were at their strongest. But this is where the plot takes that very Santa Barbara turn that will force you to rethink everything you knew about this story. You are surely convinced that Ali refused service because he was afraid of dying in the jungles of Vietnam, afraid of a sniper's bullet or a booby trap. It is logical, it is human, but it is a lie. At some point, when the pressure reached its peak, men in gray suits came to him, envoys from Washington, and put a deal on the table that was impossible to refuse. He was told in plain text, "You won't have to fight." Think about that. He was offered the role of a poster boy. He just needed to put on a uniform, smile for a couple of posters, conduct a few exhibition sparring matches on safe bases in the rear, and that was it. No trenches, no mud, full retention of titles and millions. Most of us would have grabbed this chance with our teeth, for it is the ideal exit, a patriot, alive and wealthy. But Ali looked at this contract that could give him back his life and spoke words that made the establishment foam at the mouth, words that flipped the chessboard. I will not wear the uniform to help kill and burn other people to help continue the domination of white slave masters. Do you understand what happened? He refused not the war. He refused hypocrisy. He chose prison and poverty, not out of fear of death, but out of disgust for a deal with his conscience. And in that moment, he ceased to be just an athlete, transforming into a man who single-handedly declared war on the most powerful empire in the world without even having the opportunity to throw a punch. On June 28, 1971, when the summer heat in Washington was melting the asphalt, in a room of a house in Chicago, the air was so cold you could see your breath. But this cold came not from the air conditioner, but from the grave-like waiting that had lasted 4 years. The case of Clay versus United States had finally reached its final point. The Supreme Court, the very place where hopes usually die, and you must understand that the stakes on this day were higher than in any title fight at Madison Square Garden. If the judges decided against him, it would not just be a defeat, it would be the end. 5 years in federal prison is not just a term, it is a sentence for a 30-year-old athlete. It is a guarantee that we would never see him in the ring again, that he would rot in a cell, forgotten and broken while the world moved on. You probably think Ali was confident, because he always looked confident, but let's rip off that mask. That morning he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, because all the insiders whispered that the Nixon administration was thirsty for blood, that the system does not forgive public slaps in the face, and the chances of acquittal were as ghostly as smoke. The telephone on the desk seemed like a ticking time bomb. It was silent, and this silence was louder than the roar of the crowd in a stadium. It was that very visual silence, when you can hear the blood rushing in your ears, the floorboards creaking under your feet, dust motes dancing in a beam of light, and every second of waiting stretches into eternity, exhausting the soul more than 15 rounds against Frazier. Suddenly, this vacuum is torn apart by a phone ring, a sharp, piercing sound that makes everyone flinch as if from a gunshot. Ali slowly picks up the receiver, and his hand, that very hand that could send a man into a knockout in a fraction of a second, now seems heavy as lead. On the other end of the line is his lawyer, whose voice is trembling with something impossible to immediately decipher. Is it fear? Is it grief? No, it is shock. You expect to hear about a compromise, about a reduced sentence, about a deal. But then something happens that breaks reality, that very Santa Barbara effect that makes you question if you even understand how this world works. The lawyer pronounces numbers that sound like a mistake, like the ravings of a madman. 8-0. Do you hear that? Not 5-3, not a one-vote margin, a unanimous decision. The Supreme Court, that bastion of conservatism, that pinnacle of the system Ali supposedly betrayed, stood on his side. Those very people in black robes who were supposed to destroy him acknowledged that his conscience was more important than their war. It was a moment of absolute upheaval. The state that had hounded him for years suddenly admitted defeat without even starting the final battle. But look at Ali's reaction. Are you expecting a scream? Do you expect him to start jumping, doing the shuffle, shouting out the window, "I am the greatest"? No. He simply places the receiver back on the cradle, slowly, carefully. There is no wild joy in his eyes. There is something much more terrifying and majestic there, the absolute calm of a man who knew the truth even before the judges voiced it. He does not celebrate, because for him this is not winning the lottery. It is confirmation that he was right from the very beginning, when he stood in that induction center with his hands down. In that second, he defeated the United States of America without throwing a single punch, and this quiet victory in an empty room weighed more than all the gold belts of the world combined. But he did not yet know that for this triumph he would have to pay a price we will talk about at the very end. When Muhammad Ali finally returned to the ring after 3.5 years of exile, the stadium didn't just roar, it convulsed in ecstasy, as if welcoming a resurrected prophet descended from heaven. But in this deafening noise, in this sea of flashes and tears of joy, a tragedy was hidden that was noticed only by those who looked not at the legend, but at the fighter. You probably think that justice triumphed, that the hero reclaimed his sword and was ready to chop off heads like in the good old days. But as soon as the gong announced the start of the fight, the audience felt a cold prick of disappointment. Before them was a ghost. That same Ali, who in 1967 was elusive as smoke, who could land 10 punches in 3 seconds and dodge the return with a smile, had vanished. Instead of the floating butterfly, we saw a man with lead-filled legs who could no longer dance for 15 rounds straight. His legendary speed, that divine gift, had been devoured by those very ghost years he spent in lecture halls rather than the gym. You ask yourself, did the system win after all? Did they break him simply by stealing his youth? It seemed this was the end, that he would be easy prey for young predators like Frazier or Norton. But this is where the intellectual orgasm occurs that links the beginning of our story to its finale and makes your hair stand on end. Remember that dagger from the first part, his relaxed, lowered hands at the induction center. You thought it was a gesture of submission. No, it was a prophecy. At the moment he refused to take a step forward, he unknowingly made the most terrible deal in the history of sports. He exchanged his physical invulnerability for spiritual immortality. Those 3 years of inactivity killed the perfect athlete in him. Yes, that is true. But they birthed in him something far more dangerous to his opponents, the ability to endure superhuman pain. Since his legs no longer saved him, he had to learn to take punches with his face. He had to develop a granite chin and a will that broke enemies' fists. If he had gone to the army, he would have returned just as fast, kept his millions and his health, but would have remained just one of the champions, a line in Wikipedia. But by sacrificing his peak, by allowing his body to rust in exile, he returned to the ring not as an athlete trying to earn a living, but as a living martyr who had passed through fire. People in the stands screamed not because they saw beautiful boxing. They saw him taking hits, saw his face covered in blood, and understood that he was suffering for them, for their right to say no. This is the paradox that overturns consciousness. His weakness became his new strength. Having lost his speed, he gained the heaviness of a monument that cannot be moved. He returned to prove that a man can be stripped of a license, stripped of money, stripped of the best years of his life, but cannot be stripped of greatness if he is willing to pay for his principles with his own flesh. We watched the ring and saw how he, taking blows that would kill an ordinary man, continued to stand, and there was more meaning in this standing than in all his knockout victories before the suspension. He ceased to be just a boxer. In that moment, under the lights, beaten and slow, he finally transformed into a Messiah whose wounds became the proof of his righteousness. The music cuts off abruptly, leaving you alone with a silence that rings in your ears louder than any gong, and a shot appears on the screen that became an icon of the 20th century, 1996, Atlanta, the Night Stadium. From the darkness emerges a figure in whom you struggle to recognize that cheeky demigod who promised to show how great he is. Before you is an old man whose body is bound by invisible chains, and the hand clutching the Olympic torch trembles treacherously, forcing the flame to dance a mad dance. You look at the tears in his eyes, at this Parkinson's mask frozen on his face, and feel a surge of pity mixed with awe. But I am not here to squeeze a sentimental tear out of you. I am here to reveal the last, most terrible truth hiding behind this greatness, a truth that turns this story from a sports drama into an antique tragedy. You think the disease is just an accident? A genetic lottery? No. It is a direct result of that very signature on the suspension order in 1967. Remember the ghost years, those 3 years of inactivity we spoke about. They are what killed his legs. Precisely because the government stole his peak form, he was forced to change his fighting style. Instead of dodging punches, he began to take them. He absorbed damage with his skull because he could no longer float like a butterfly. Every second of that downtime, every day without training eventually converted into brain micro-traumas that decades later stole his voice. A blood-curdling paradox. The system couldn't break his spirit in court, but it broke his body by forcing him to become a punching sponge to regain the title. The Louisville Lip, the man who could talk anyone to death, found himself locked in the silent prison of his own flesh, and this was the price he paid for his no. But before you call him a saint, let's look at the other side of this medal, where the word traitor is engraved. While you admire his principles, thousands of Vietnam veterans look at that torch with hatred. Ask yourself the uncomfortable question that destroys the hero's image. Is this fair? While Ali toured colleges, well-fed and healthy guys of his age died in the mud of the jungles, torn apart by mines and machine gun bursts. They couldn't say no. They didn't have millions for lawyers. They had no choice. For them, Ali is not a symbol of freedom, but a selfish star who used his religion as a shield to save his own hide, while ordinary Americans returned home in zinc coffins. Do you feel this dissonance? You want to love him, but the ghost of those soldiers stands behind his back and whispers, "And where were you, champ?" And now, when you see the full picture, from the relaxed hands at the induction center to the trembling hand with the torch, I place the scales of history before you. On one scale, the greatest sporting legacy and the courage to go against the system, inspiring millions to fight for their rights. On the other, thousands of lives of those who went to fight in his place, and his own health sacrificed. Who is he to you in the bottom line? A Messiah who sacrificed himself to stop the madness of war, or a coward who hid behind loud words, leaving his fellow citizens to die? Was his refusal an act of supreme humanism or an act of supreme selfishness? This is not a rhetorical question. This is a test of your moral compass. Go down to the comments right now. I want to see your truth. Hero or traitor? Write one word. Let the fight begin.